Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots like you to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking with Catherine Cavagnaro about flaps and some misperceptions that people have about them, plus listener feedback. Last week in episode 179, we talked about 8 lessons that any pilot can learn about handling emergencies from the United 328 engine failure. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you would, take a moment right now to look at the app you're listening to us on and find that share button. And then go ahead and share this show with a friend and encourage them to subscribe to the show. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, we have 2 incidents where someone spoke up at the right time when they saw something that wasn't right and averted accidents. A government agency is about to do a lot of hiring, and we have a heartwarming story of what the Air Force did for a 5-year-old girl. All this and more, and the news starts now. From 1mileatatime.com, Frontier flight narrowly avoids catastrophic de-icing incident. This is a note that was written from Frontier Airlines to the Airline Pilots Association Safety Council. The note, which was allegedly sent regarding the incident, says, "Greetings, Air Safety Organization and ALPA," that's the Airline Pilots Association Safety Council. Earlier this week, during the massive snowstorms throughout the central and eastern states, we had a de-ice accident that could have led to a catastrophic outcome. We, FFT, I think that's Frontier Airlines, had an aircraft request and received Type 1 and Type 4 de-icing. The vendor stated to our flight deck crew that the aircraft was de-iced and clear of contaminants. Upon reaching the runway and preparing for departure, an alarmed flight attendant called the flight deck stating that the wings were covered with snow and ice still. The flight crew visually inspected and returned to the gate. Both wings had about a foot of snow and ice still covering the wings, with some fluid sprayed throughout the wing area. We found out the vendor was running low on fluid. They have since been terminated from our operations. We're letting everyone know as a safety precaution about our experience with them at BNA, which would be the Nashville airport. Following the incident, a Frontier Airlines spokesperson confirmed the incident and stated the following: "Safety is our foremost priority, and we are proud of our flight crew for identifying the issue and ensuring the matter was addressed before takeoff. We are no longer using the de-icing company in question." Meanwhile, spokesperson for the de-icing company said there was a breakdown in the detailed and vigorous de-icing process in Nashville. An aircraft that had remained overnight during the storm was not fully de-iced. "We applaud the efforts of the Frontier flight crew for detecting the issue before initiating flight. Nothing of this sort has happened in the past 50-plus years, and we have vigorously attacked the underlying circumstances to prevent anything like this in the future." And the article says, how could de-icers allow this to happen? It can't be understated how major this issue could have been. Several fatal plane crashes have occurred over the years due to de-icing. So huge kudos to the flight attendant who was so observant, or perhaps a passenger who informed the flight attendant, with the flight attendant relaying the information to the pilots. One has to wonder how exactly this could have happened, given that it should have been obvious to any onlookers that the de-icing wasn't done correctly. Bottom line, according to the article, a Frontier Airlines flight had a near catastrophe due to a de-icing incident. As I've said before on the show, if you see something that's not quite right, speak up. And you don't have to be a pilot to do that. Just let somebody know anytime you see something that doesn't look quite right. And here's a second story about speaking up. This comes from the BBC.com. They say Birmingham Airport, which would be in England, stepladder left on runway as planes land. 3-passenger aircraft narrowly missed a stepladder that fell off the back of an airport maintenance truck and was left on the runway as they landed. An investigation is found. The probe said the 7-foot item was not removed until after the 3rd plane had touched down at Birmingham Airport. Aviation authorities have ruled a bungee cord fastening to secure the ladder was not suitable. The airport said it has since changed procedures. Nobody was hurt by the object's presence in the middle of the runway, and none of the planes were damaged. But a report by the Air Accident Investigation Branch, the AAIB, said with landing speeds in excess of 120 knots, an aircraft hitting an object such as the ladder may have resulted in substantial damage. In this case, taking the position of the ladder on the runway into account and the main and nose landing gear track width, all 3 aircraft narrowly missed the ladder. The AAIB said the ladder was among the apparatus of 2 airport technicians who've been working on runway 33's approach lights. As they accelerated on their way to their next task, the ladder fell from their truck and came to rest just to the right of the runway centerline, the report found. 3 aircraft later touched down with the item in their sight. The crew of the second aircraft, a Boeing 737, was the first to alert air traffic control, reporting that an unknown object appeared to be on the runway. The crew of the first plane, also a Boeing 737, then reported that it had seen something similar. The third aircraft, a Boeing 757, was warned there could be something on the runway, but the crew decided to land and then reported seeing a stepladder. The object was then found near the touchdown zone. The reports that a bungee cord used to secure it to the truck came from the maintenance organization's own supplies, and while more suitable securing equipment was available, it was not readily at hand. At first sight, the bungee may have seemed suitable to secure the ladder, the investigation found, but added the way it was attached to the truck was unsuitable because it was stretched almost to its limit. An airport spokesperson said the site had carried out a full investigation with changes identified. Well, good that the second flight crew spoke up, but two things stand out about this to me. First, why didn't the first flight crew report that they had seen something when they first saw it? That crew didn't say anything until the second crew reported it. And why did the third crew land? Knowing that there was something on the runway, why wouldn't you go around and request that the airport inspect the runway before you come back around to land? From aerospace-testing-international.com, Rolls-Royce has completed the first taxiing of its Spirit of Innovation aircraft ahead of its first flight in an attempt to break the world record for the fastest electric airplane later this year. The airplane traveled along a runway driven by its 500 horsepower, which is 400 kilowatts, electric powertrain for the first time last month. Rolls-Royce plans to set the world record for the fastest electric aircraft in the world by achieving a target speed of more than 300 miles per hour early next year. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, the fastest electric aircraft in the world is the Extra 330 LE, which during a flight on March 23, 2017 in Germany, reached a top speed of 213 miles per hour. The Spirit of Innovation Technology demonstrator uses electric motors and controllers from YASA, that's Y-A-S-A, and aviation startup Electroflight. It is being developed as part of a £6.3 million or $9 million ACCEL, which stands for Accelerating the Electrification of Flight, research program, which is being funded in part by the UK government. Ground testing of the Spirit of Innovation was completed last September after 9 months, during which time the propeller was run up to full speed around 2,400 RPM, using what Rolls-Royce said is the most power-dense battery pack ever assembled for aircraft propulsion. Over 6,000 cells are packaged into the demonstrator's battery pack. Rolls-Royce hopes the developments made for the Spirit of Innovation's electric powertrain and battery system will be used in the company's future range of motors, power electronics, and batteries for the general aerospace, urban air mobility, and small commuter aircraft sectors. From FAA.gov, pilots and air traffic controllers may receive the J&J vaccine with appropriate precautions. Following the emergency use authorization from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for Johnson & Johnson's COVID-19 vaccine, the FAA has determined that pilots and others who perform safety-sensitive duties may receive the vaccine under the conditions of their FAA-issued medical certification. FAA and contract air traffic controllers, who are subject to FAA medical clearance, may also receive the vaccine. To maintain the highest levels of safety in the national airspace system, the FAA will require that affected recipients of this single-dose vaccine to wait 48 hours before conducting safety-sensitive aviation duties such as flying or controlling air traffic. The FAA will evaluate additional vaccines as they receive FDA emergency use authorization and will advise pilots and air traffic controllers of any required waiting periods. The agency previously cleared the FDA-approved Moderna and Pfizer vaccines for aviation use, subject to the same 48-hour waiting periods. The FAA applies similar brief waiting periods after administration of other vaccines, including those for tuberculosis and typhoid. From avweb.com, pandemic jet buyers regretting purchases. Sounds like a story of buyer's remorse. The COVID-19 pandemic sparked a surge in used business jet sales in 2020, and there's been a boomerang effect in 2021 as first-time owners take stock of those purchases. A virtual town hall of aircraft brokerages, hosted by Corporate Jet Investor, revealed that a significant number of those who thought a private aircraft was an easy solution to the travel challenges created by the pandemic are now experiencing buyer's remorse. Janine Iannarelli of Par Avion said, "When I start down the path of trying to educate buyers, they are absolutely shocked." The brokers also cautioned those of thinking of buying a used jet that many of the best buys are already gone. Much of what's left is outdated and in need of major upgrades to be truly useful. Demand has moderated over the winter, but the town hall was told that another spike in sales is expected this summer as the lingering effects of the pandemic continue to restrict travel options. From yahoo.com, this is a really short story. TSA wants to hire 6,000 officers ahead of summer travel surge. The Transportation Security Administration is now hiring. TSA is looking to hire 6,000 new security officers as it gets ready for an expected surge in summer travel. The jobs will be for positions at 433 airports across the country. TSA said it will use virtual job fairs and other recruitment efforts to help fill those positions. And I'll include a link to the TSA jobs website in our show notes. From avweb.com, NetJets secures options for 20 supersonic bizjets. NetJets has signed an agreement with supersonic aircraft developer Aerion, that's Aerion, that includes purchase options for 20 Aerion AS2 supersonic business jets. According to Aerion, the deal brings the value of its order backlog to approximately $10 billion. The company also announced plans to collaborate with aviation training provider Flight Safety International to develop a flight training academy for supersonic civil, commercial, and military aircraft. Aerion CEO Tom Weiss said, quote, "Our strategy is to connect the very best partners in the world within a new mobility ecosystem optimized for speed and founded on sustainability. In NetJets and Flight Safety International, we have two such partners, both globally recognized leaders in their fields who share our passion for a new era of mobility that is both fast and at the same time kind to our planet." Aerion's AS2 is expected to have a top speed of Mach 1.4 and supersonic range of 4,200 nautical miles. It will be powered by GE's new Affinity engine and outfitted with an avionics suite that's being developed in partnership with Honeywell. As previously reported by AvWeb, Aerion is aiming to begin AS2 production in 2023 at its planned facility in Melbourne, Florida. From AINonline.com, Ericsson to begin flying optionally piloted air crane next year. Boy, we've had a lot of stories recently about aircraft that are going to be flown without a pilot on board. Looks like Ericsson's going to do the same thing. They plan to make the first flight of their optionally piloted S-64F Plus air crane next year, with customer deliveries of the new helicopter variant to begin as early as 2024, the company announced. A senior Ericsson executive said the high-hot performance of the F Plus will be improved over the current production model. The new composite main rotor blades alone will increase the payload at 25 degrees C and 8,000 feet by 88%, offering an additional 755 pounds of capability, while climb rate at max gross weight and 2,000 feet will rise nearly 70% from 1,300 feet per minute to 2,200 feet per minute. Ericsson will seek both military and civil customers for the new helicopter, which it plans to be certifiable for Part 135 operations and capable of external lifts up to 25,000 pounds. The company began dropping hints about the F Plus last year, saying it would be available as an upgrade kit to legacy aircraft while projecting a need for 50 to 100 new airframes. Now repurposing Vietnam-era Sikorsky CH-54 airframes for its new production aircraft, Ericsson said it would soon deplete those and need to begin manufacturing new aircraft from scratch. To that end, Ericsson has recently upgraded its manufacturing capabilities with 3D printing and digital data. And finally, from Facebook.com, the MacDill Air Force Base page, 5-year-old battling cancer becomes pilot for a day at MacDill Air Force Base. Captain Ever Young, a 5-year-old battling cancer, was given her official orders to be a pilot for the day from Colonel Benjamin Johnson, 6th ARW commander. With help from the National Pediatric Cancer Foundation, Ever was able to make her dream of becoming a U.S. Air Force pilot come true, MacDill Air Force Base said. During her visit to MacDill, Ever was able to fly and land a flight simulator, tour a KC-135 Stratotanker, and the air traffic control tower, and enjoy lunch on base. Well, what a great, wonderful thing for the Air Force to have done. And I must say there are just some great heartwarming photos on their Facebook page, and I'll include a link to it in our show notes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com/180. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, my weekly updates. And then we'll talk with Catherine Cavagnaro about flaps, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Now here's a fun flying destination.
Hi, Max. My name is Sandy Schmidt, and I fly a Belanca Super Viking out of Martin State Airport in Baltimore, Maryland. I'd like to start off by saying that you have a great podcast. Keep up the good work. I wanted to share with your listeners a very unique island destination in Upper Michigan. The island is Mackinac Island, and the identifier for the airport is KMCD. The airport runway is 3,501 feet long, 75 feet wide, and in great condition. There is a paved ramp for parking and a nominal overnight parking fee. No fuel is available. A visit to Mackinac Island is like a visit to an island community that time left behind. There are no cars on the island, and you can only get there by ferry or by airplane. When you call for a taxi from the airport, a carriage pulled by 2 horses will show up and take you to town. Mackinac Island is the home of the Grand Hotel, where the movie Somewhere in Time, starring Christopher Reeves, was filmed in 1980, and where many notable governors and presidents have visited. Staying at the Grand Hotel can be an expensive experience, but there are plenty of less expensive options available in town. The island is very small and features many beautiful homes, a horse-drawn carriage museum, Fort Mackinac, the Michigan governor's summer mansion, walking and bike paths, and many fine restaurants, just to name a few of the many things to do. You can easily circumnavigate the island by bicycle in a couple of hours. The harbor area where the ferry docks is also beautiful. The Mackinac Island season is limited due to the severe winters in northern Michigan. August is the best time to visit, although the season technically runs from May through October. Fly safe, everyone.
Sandy, thanks so much for sharing that fun flying destination. I would love to go there sometime. I do remember the movie Somewhere in Time. I saw it when it came out back in 1980. And for those who haven't seen the movie, a quick description I found online here says a Chicago playwright, which would be Christopher Reeves, uses self-hypnosis to travel back in time and meet the actress whose vintage portrait hangs in the hotel. And I enjoyed the movie, though I have to tell you, it was very unusual at the end. It was the only time I remember the audience breaking out in laughter at the end, as I think they found the ending just a little bit improbable, or something about the way it was staged. It just broke everybody up in the audience in laughter. So I'm not sure the director intended it that way, but it was fun nonetheless. And if you'd like to send your fun flying destination, just go ahead and use the voice memo app on your phone, record maybe 90 seconds, and send it to me at aviationnewstalk@gmail.com. And hey, thanks for waiting for a couple of weeks for this episode. I just had a lot going on and I needed to take a break. One of those things was going to a wedding in the family. No, not mine. But it was a nice little event held outdoors at the Chinese Pavilion in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. When I say small, it was just 10 people. It was not the big wedding that had been planned, but it was probably even more intimate since it was small. And yes, people were wearing masks except when they were eating. Anyway, I'm happy to be back with you here on Aviation News Talk. And here's a quick note from AOPA about TIS-A. It looks like the FAA is considering ending this capability at some point in the future. TIS, of course, is a traffic service that comes off of about roughly 100 terminal radar facilities scattered around the country. And for years, the FAA has talked about decommissioning these, which means that people who rely on TIS would no longer have traffic capability in the aircraft. For example, if you look at all the 172s built since the G1000 went into the airplane back in 2004, up until fairly recently when ADS-B was installed in these aircraft, those aircraft all relied on TIS. Now, some of the higher-end aircraft like the Cessna 182 had more expensive TAS systems, and they will still get traffic even if TIS goes away. Anyway, the AOPA has a TIS-A sunset survey to assist the FAA in its impact analysis of sunsetting TIS-A, and they are hoping to gather information from AOPA members on their aircraft equipage, their use of TIS-A, and their estimate of the TIS-A sunset. They say, please help us with this analysis by participating in the short survey, and I will include a link to the survey in our show notes. And I wanted to let you know that I was a recent guest on the Airline Pilot Guy podcast. That's episode 463, which just came out a few days ago, so you may want to check that out. If you're not familiar with the Airline Pilot Guy, they describe it as their view from their side of the cockpit door. Basically, Captain Jeff expresses his opinion and perspective as a pilot at a commercial airline, and they talk about weather, how it pertains to the job, piloting, aviation safety, layovers, and lots of other news related to the airline industry. So you may want to listen to that if you haven't heard the show before. And I want to thank Captain Jeff and his co-hosts for having me on the show. They rarely have guests on that show, so I was delighted when they invited me to join them. So check it out. And I saw a rather intriguing photo in the past week or so. This was an unusual place to find it. I just happened to see it on Snopes.com. I'm not usually on the website, but it popped up It's something else I was looking at. And it says, is this a real photo of an airplane and a train on a runway? That really caught my attention because I couldn't remember seeing a train on a runway before. And it says, in March 2021, an online advertisement appeared to show an airplane and a train on an airport runway with steam pouring out of the train's engine. The caption of the ad may have led readers to believe that the plane was about to hit the train. It said 17 airports with the most dangerous landings in the world. It had all the makings of being a misleading photo. First, it was an online ad, which often is not reliable. The shadows looked too perfect. The light was bright and sunny. The grass was green and pretty. Perhaps maybe it was just a flight simulation video game. However, the photograph is real. The simple truth is that New Zealand is just a beautiful country. It was photographed at Gisborne Airport in Gisborne. And it goes on to explain, a caption appeared on page 19 in the 2014 issue of Vector magazine, a publication about aviation. It says, a Grumman TBF Avenger waits on runway 32 while Gisborne City Vintage Railways train, headed by the 1897 locomotive WA-165, crosses its path. And it says the airplane in the photo was not in motion at the time. And on Reddit, a user tells us that it was parked with wheel chocks. And they go on to say that air traffic controllers at Gisborne say pilots on approach should not be alarmed by the absence of the long-established signals telling them a train is about to cross the runway. For the past 20 years, horizontal red flashing lights on large white boards adjacent to the sealed north-south runway at Gisborne have warned pilots a train crossing was imminent and the runway was closed. Steady green light signaled the runway was open. Both sets of lights have now been mothballed. Featured in a number of websites dedicated to the world's strangest airports, it's believed the rail line was established well before local authorities decided in the mid-1940s the site was also the best for an aerodrome. Air traffic controllers have always had to juggle train crossings and aircraft landings, although since Kiwi Rail scrapped its Gisborne Napier service, the only trains now use the runway crossing belong to the local vintage train club. So, rather interesting photo, and I will include a link to that in our show notes. And I did participate in a webinar recently that was hosted by NAA, the National Aeronautical Association. Miles O'Brien, you may recall him as an aviation reporter, was one of the people on the webinar. And at the end, he mentioned that he has an episode coming up on the PBS show called Nova. The topic he mentioned was something like, I didn't get the exact name, but I think he said the Great Electric Airplane Air Race. And he mentioned that will be aired on Friday, May 12th. So you may want to check your local PBS listings and add that to your calendar. And I will include a link to what I think he might be referring to, which is an Airbus-sponsored air race. And here's an email from Patreon mega supporter Brian Deere. It's regarding authorization for foreign experimental aircraft to fly in Mexico. And this is an email that came from the Baja Bush pilots. I didn't even realize this, but apparently experimental aircraft have not been routinely allowed to fly in Mexico in the past. And they say that Mexico law does allow for procedures to accept non-certificated aircraft in Mexico. And although in the past this was allowed without special permission, now legal procedures must be established and completed for this to continue. One huge question was the volume and kind of foreign aircraft that wish Mexican authorization. In order to give a valid estimate, I'm requesting that anyone who wishes to fly to Mexico in a non-certificated aircraft provide me the following information. And by the way, this comes from Jack at Baja Bush Pilots. He's the one looking for this information. He says, please understand that the information is non-committal and only will be used by Mexico to determine the need for this special procedure. And he's looking for 5 things: the type of non-certificated aircraft, if it's a kit, the make or manufacturer, the model of the kit, for example, the model number like RV6, who assembled the aircraft, whether it was the owner or a third party, the year the aircraft was first flown. Yes, put in the date, he says. Please provide the above information by number in your reply, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for each of those items, as well as any other information you wish to provide, and we will tabulate it and present it to AFAC. I need to have this information by Friday, March 19th, so you'll need to do this pretty quickly. He says, let's get this thing put together, accepted, and get experimental aircraft back into Mexico. So if this is of interest to you, you can email all of your information about this to Jack at bajabushpilots.com. And congratulations to one of our Patreon members, Matthew Bruder, who wrote, Hey Max, I just took my first solo flight today. Thanks for being one of the people who have helped me safely along the way with their knowledge and tips. Matthew, congratulations. I think everyone remembers their first solo flight. I certainly remember mine. Matthew sent along a great little video of his first solo, and I didn't realize until I saw it. He's a fairly young guy, and he's also in Genesee County Airport in Western New York, not terribly far where I grew up from. So I'll include a link to the video in the show notes. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Jeff Martin. He says, "Good morning, Max. I have been having a busy couple of weeks and have a long day ahead of me. I just wanted to thank you for the M&R Comedy Hour." That was the Max and Rob Comedy Hour. He says, "It was so tacky and full of tasteless humor," those must have been the jokes that Rob was telling, "that I can't stop giggling now. I needed that. Thank you. Have a good day." And if you haven't caught that, that was almost 4 years ago, episode number 29. I've created a shortcut link so you can find it easily at aviationnewstalk.com/29. And that was an hour of jokes that Rob, Mark, and I alternated reading back and forth, and we had great fun doing that show. And so I'm curious, what's an hour of good flight instruction worth to you? Hopefully you've gotten more than an hour's worth of good flight instruction from the 180 episodes that we've done. I'd like to encourage you to sign up to become a supporter of the show. It turns out that more than half the email I get is from people who support the show, so they tend to be the most engaged. And we have some new Patreon supporters. Both Martin Miller and Victor C. have edited their pledges up to $20 a month, which means they can now receive the bonus videos that I post periodically on the Patreon website. And we also have new supporters in Kelly Bergman, Niraj Penza, or maybe Penzi, I'm not quite sure, Anil Srivasta, Sukumar Iyer, Chase Haig, and Robert Cobble, who added his pledge up to $8 a month. We also had some one-time donations made through PayPal. Matthew Arnold, who donated $150, and John Chargo, who donated $100, and he donated last year as well. So some people like to donate once a year in a large lump sum, and you can do that by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, or if you'd like to donate monthly, you can also do that via PayPal, or if you do it via Patreon at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, you'll get some of the various goodies that we offer at the different levels, and you'll find those listed on the website. And of course, once a month, I mention all of our mega supporters who donate $50 a month or more. They, of course, get one of my books after 2 months. They include Brian Deere, who flies a Turbo 206, Tyson Weiss, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight, Bruce Dickerson, who's a financial planner in Georgia and flies a Bonanza, Victor Vogel, who lives in central PA and flies a Cirrus, Tim Delaney, who I just talked to again on the phone. He's a wealth manager in Santa Rosa and flies an SR20 out of Santa Rosa Airport. Stephen Elop, he flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+. He's the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, he's the president of Keomac and TCB Composites and flies a 172. Seth Lake, he's a DPE. He gives check rides, and he specializes in teaching the multi-engine rating in his pair of beach travel airs. So if you want to get your multi-engine rating, check him out at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he teaches in the Cincinnati area out of the Lunken Flight Training Center, and also to private owners of people who own Pipers, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He's still teaching part-time, but is looking to go full-time someday after he leaves the day job. Justin Winters, he brokers real estate on Lake Keowee in South Carolina and flies an SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation, they have a pair of T-240 aircraft and a 2021 Piper M350 on order. Johnny McDade, singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss, who flies out of the Republic Airport on Long Island, New York. He's working on his CFI and Double I, and he teaches aviation at Pilot Proficiency International as an advanced and instrument ground instructor, and you can find him on his Facebook page at Ground.9. Charlie Mason flies out of Austin, Texas, and is working on his instrument rating. Vincent Salimi, he's the vice mayor for the city of Pinole and owns Salimi Construction Management. Just heard from him. He's just been elected the president of the Concord Flying Club, which has a Cessna 182, a Vans RV-7, and an A36 Bonanza available. They limit themselves to just 30 members. And he says it's the longest running club west of the Mississippi. They were organized back in 1939. Jim Hopp, who's a CFI and teaches at Advantage Aviation at Palo Alto Airport. Joseph Sheehan flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his Vision Jet. Josiah Friedman, working on an instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's a new AME in Florida at the Naples Municipal Airport. If you need a basic med, second or third class flight physical, you can find him at aviatorsclinic.com. William Birch donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela, he's with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up and IFR refresher courses at iflyifr.com. Don Dillman's a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI and flies a Bonanza. Rick Mattis, an owner of PointWise, which makes CFD simulation software used by aerospace companies, and you can find them at pointwise.com. John Tosto lives in Flint, Michigan, where he flies at the Greater Flint Pilots Association that has 4 planes for rent. He also co-owns a Cherokee 6. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires. He runs botinsteel.com, which makes industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford, he flies a Diamond DA-40 at Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps children with dyslexia. Greg Vann, he's a senior AME at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and he's the host of the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which I recommend. They discuss medical issues for pilots. James Kerr, he's interested in buying an SR20 for business travel. His company makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find them at bosssecurity-screens.com. Orell English, he's a CFI and CFII at Westchester Flying Club at Westchester County Airport in New York. He and a friend have created a website to make free flight planning modern and fast. The site's called Flyway, and you can check it out at flyway.cc. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. He says his 2-year-old son, Bennett, is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch, who I don't have any information on, but I thank him for his support. Michael Ron, he runs a small wealth management firm in Woodland, Texas, which you can find at thesumplanning.com. He's thinking of buying a Cirrus. And Todd Cussall lives in Arizona and flies an SR-22 G5. Thank you so much to everyone who supports the show in whatever way you do. Coming up next, we've got Catherine Cavagnaro talking about flaps, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Catherine Cavagnaro. She's an expert on spins, aerobatics, and upset recovery techniques, and she once performed 60 continuous spins in her Cessna 152. And we talked with her about stalls and spins in episode 155, and there's also a YouTube version of that interview available on the aviationnewstalk.com YouTube channel. Catherine not only holds an ATP and CFI certificate, but she's also a PhD in mathematics. She is a professor of math at the University of the South and has chaired the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. She's the 2020 National CFI of the Year and writes for a number of magazines. Catherine also serves as a designated pilot examiner, and she owns a flight school called ACE Aerobatics School that's located at the Sewanee Franklin County Airport on the campus of the University of the South. And now here's our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro. Well, Catherine, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you back here again.
Thanks so much, Max. I appreciate being back.
Well, you're a busy lady. You do a lot of different things. We're going to be talking about flaps today. Tell us some stories. What kinds of things have occurred to you that are flap related?
Yeah, I've got 2 stories that involve flaps. One is from a recent practical exam that I was giving for the commercial checkride. And this candidate was turning base, and I thought to myself, wow, he looks a little bit low. And just to back up, for the power off 180, a beam the touchdown point, the candidate has to retard the throttle all the way and then glide to a spot on the runway. He or she cannot touch down before that spot and has to touch down within 200 feet after the spot. So it's a pretty tricky maneuver. You really have to understand the drag qualities of your airplane and be very familiar with those. So anyway, we're on base and I'm thinking to myself, wow, he looks a little bit low. And, you know, it's funny, as examiners, we're really rooting for the candidates. And I found myself leaning over toward the center of the airplane as if I was trying to will this airplane onto final sooner. But anyway, we're coming in and I thought, wow, I think he is going to make this. And then at the last moment, just as we crossed the threshold and we're headed for those 1,000-foot markers, he goes ahead and adds full flaps and promptly plants the airplane way short of the touchdown point. And unfortunately, that is not satisfactory. And I'll tell you, I was a bit exasperated because, again, we're rooting for our candidates. And I think it took every bit of restraint not to let that show when I asked him afterward, why on earth did you add flaps? And he said, well, I knew I was coming in maybe just a little bit short. So I added flaps to increase the lift. And my heart sank because here's somebody who I think could understand or could be helped by a better understanding of exactly what flaps do for us. So my second story is actually also about a practical exam where yours truly was the candidate, and it was for my private. And I remember my examiner asked me, so, Catherine, what do flaps do for us? Why do we add flaps when we're landing? And I gave an answer that I'm sure sounded memorized. And I said that, well, it lets us increase our descent angle without picking up unwanted airspeed. And I saw him roll his eyes. I always remembered that, thinking, okay, I really should probably get more than a book answer of the effect of flaps. So since that time, I've done a good bit of thinking about flaps, and that's what I would like to share with your listeners today.
That's great. It's funny how events like that kind of get us motivated to find out even more about a subject. If we somehow haven't performed as well as we wanted in the checkride, that's the extra incentive you need to go back and learn everything there is to learn about it. Well, let's go ahead and jump into it. Let's go ahead and talk about flaps.
So first of all, as my candidate said, and correctly, extending flaps does in fact increase the lift. Specifically, flaps increase the coefficient of lift. And what happens is when you extend your flaps, your wing is capable of achieving a higher lift coefficient. And that's one of the ingredients that goes into lift itself. So with flaps extended in the downward position, then again, we get greater lift. Interestingly, the critical angle of attack actually goes down. So your wing will actually stall at a lower angle of attack with flaps deployed. Of course, flaps also add drag, and that addition of drag can actually be pretty profound. So for the folks who get to see the piece on YouTube, I just included a video of a smoke tunnel video with a wing inside it. And you see that when you deploy the flaps downward, you're creating more of a turbulent area in the back, sort of a dead air zone. Well, that dead air zone takes energy to create, and that's energy that you're not spending creating lift. So extending the flaps also increases drag. And that's what my candidate forgot, is that, again, it increases drag. So if you think about what mattered in that situation, it's really, was the lift helping him more than the drag was hurting him? In that case, it was actually the opposite. The drag hurt him more than the lift helped him. And the way that we can compare those two quantities, the increase in lift with the increase in drag, is by looking at what's called the lift to drag ratio. And extending flaps definitely hurts your lift to drag ratio. And we can also think about lift to drag ratio as the, say, distance that we would glide for a fixed altitude loss. So for example, for the Cessna Cardinal, the lift to drag ratio is, with flaps 0, is 11.1. So for every 1 foot of altitude loss, I should be able to glide 11.1 feet forward. But when you put 30 degrees of flaps down, suddenly your lift to drag ratio or your glide ratio becomes only 8.43. And that may not sound like an enormous difference, but it actually is. For example, this is considering a Cardinal that loses its engine, say, at 6,000 feet. The distance that airplane would be able to glide is shown on this sectional chart that I have. That's with 30 degrees of flaps. And when the flaps are retracted, that area becomes much greater. And if you want to think about it in terms of area, in a no-wind situation, this circle represents the area that would be available to me with my flaps up versus when I had them down. And that's actually a 73% increase in area. So I have 73% more area that's attainable to me in a no-wind situation were I to lose my engine if I make sure that my flaps are up. So you can see what a profound effect that retracting your flaps would have in a favorable way in terms of an engine out situation.
Yeah, and there are going to be some other things people are going to want to remember as well, too, such as if they've got a constant speed propeller, then they're going to take that prop control and pull it all the way back, and that's going to also increase the glide distance considerably. And I think people forget that probably more than any other thing that they can do to increase glide distance.
Yeah, I've done a couple articles for AOPA about exactly that. And that difference, by the way, is profound. So were you so unfortunate as to have an engine failure and you really need to glide someplace to more favorable terrain, you definitely want to put your flaps up. If at all possible, pull your prop back so it's in a high pitch, low RPM. That has a huge effect on glide ratio. Here's another example that I brought up for the Lance Air, and this shows 3 lift to drag ratios for some moderate flap settings. The Lance Air, a much more efficient airframe, has a lift to drag ratio with no flaps of about 16.35. So the Lance Air is capable of gliding a good bit farther than the Cessna Cardinal, with flaps 4 degrees down. So that's not much. The lift to drag ratio is not affected terribly. It goes down to about 16.3. But what's remarkable about the Lance Air, and some other aircraft are able to do this, is you can actually put the flaps in a negative setting. So with the flaps set at -7, the glide ratio goes up to 18.0. So that's a huge increase in glide ratio with flaps at a negative setting. Not all aircraft, in fact, most aircraft, I suspect, aren't capable of that, but some of the MALs are. So you'll see them out there, and in an engine out situation, you may well want to put your flaps in what's called a reflex position, which is a negative position. So as I did get correct on my private pilot check ride, extending your flaps does in fact increase your descent angle. And that can be a good thing. So it's not a good thing if you actually have to travel someplace. But say that you do have the field made, and maybe there's a big tree that is right before your runway, increasing the descent angle can be a good thing. So certainly extending flaps to increase your descent angle would be a good thing. Here's something that's interesting. In my Cessna 152, I did some tests and found that the lift to drag ratio in a no-wind situation using 30 degrees of flaps is the same as with no flaps and a 20-knot headwind. So the 30 degrees of flaps is worth a 20-knot headwind, which again, for descent angle, if you're trying to get over an object, that's a good thing. If you're actually trying to travel someplace, that's a very bad thing. So just to put things in perspective and compare those two with flaps versus a headwind. Climb angle, it sometimes it can help you climb over an object that maybe if you were in a clean configuration, you might not be able to have that steep a climb angle. But they do definitely hurt your ability to climb. So if your POH recommends climbing with flaps, then you make sure that you have your object cleared, and then it's probably better to go ahead and clean the plane up and probably assume a higher airspeed if that's appropriate for better engine cooling.
And that would be after you clear the obstacle, I guess.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, definitely after you clear the obstacle. Extending flaps also increases washout. And what washout refers to is sort of a twisting along the wing. We know that rectangular wings have the best stalling characteristics. They tend to stall at the root and allow us to feel that buffet and the early signs of a stall onset while our ailerons are still effective. Once we have a wing plan form like this one that is tapered, we lose some of that good stalling characteristics. So they don't by nature stall at the root first. So what manufacturers will do is they change the angle they give a bit of a twist to the wing. So near the root, the wing would tend to have a higher angle of incidence, and then that is washed out by the time you get to the tip. So you can force those more favorable stall characteristics on the airplane by putting that sort of twist or washout into the wing. And when you extend the flaps, you are, again, that's another way of raising the angle of incidence, I guess, or attack on the inboard portion of the wing. So when you have flaps down, you are increasing the washout, in which case you are improving the handling characteristics of the airplane at lower airspeeds. Extending flaps does, in fact, reduce stall speed. So this is from my Bonanza POH, and you can see that with flaps, calibrated airspeed with flaps up, my stall speed is about, under standard conditions, is about 63 knots, and that goes down to 54 knots with flaps deployed. So certainly extending flaps does help with lowering stall speed, and we really like a low stall speed when it comes time to land. Landing distance stopping distance is a function of the square of your touchdown speed. So anything you can do generally to reduce that is going to help you land in a more confined area more effectively. If you are in gusty conditions, though, there's probably good reason to not extend full flaps, because one thing that extending flaps does is it changes your pitch attitude. And if you're in gusty conditions, you are more likely to, say, touch down maybe with your nose wheel in a lower position than you would if you had less than full flaps. So you get a nice nose high landing, or it's easier to get a nose high landing when you don't have as much flaps extended.
Yeah, I think another key thing about touching down at a lower speed is that the energy of the aircraft is also a function of the speed, the square of the speed. And so if you have an accident, boy, the impact upon you and your passengers is going to be significantly higher. So yeah, I understand that sometimes people think, oh, I should land faster, but boy, it's rare that you really want to do that, because if you do, you're possibly setting yourself up for bigger injuries if something goes wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a great point. Again, stopping distance and energy are both functions of the square of that speed. So just to put things in perspective, if I normally touch down at 60 knots, but instead I touch down at 66 knots, that's a 10% increase. My landing distance and the energy that I would need to dissipate, if you want to think about that as survivability, like you mentioned, Max, that is a 21% increase. So, or actually, that's
No, you got it. Yeah, because 1.1 squared is going to be 1.21.
Right.
So yeah,
No,
21% increase. Yeah.
I said it funny about the survivability. Your survivability would sort of go down. It would be inversely related. So, but yeah, what I said was correct about the energy and the airspeed is a function of the square. So it doesn't take much to a few extra knots to really extend that landing distance and the energy that you would need to dissipate, say, in an emergent situation. Another thing that flaps do is they change your pitch attitude. So I took a couple of videos in my Bonanza, and this is the last part of an instrument approach that I was alone, so I'm flying it obviously not under the hood, but I wanted to make sure that I was coming in at the same angle, both clean and with flaps. So first I flew the approach in a clean configuration, and the difference in power that I needed to maintain that 3-degree path is actually considerable. I think at this point I'm at about 12 inches of manifold pressure. And then I came in for the approach again, and at this point I'm at about 18 inches of manifold pressure, same airspeed, same descent profile. So adding flaps means that it's going to take a whole lot more power in order to keep that same descent profile. And one other thing that you can notice if you get to see these two videos is the change in pitch angle. So another nice thing that flaps do for us, and this is, by the way, what my private pilot examiner, I think, was looking for, is a little more practical approach to, or more than what I gave in terms of a practical approach for what flaps can do for us. In this case, the pitch attitude of the aircraft is considerably lower. And if I fly my instrument approach with flaps, I'm going to pay the price with more power needed, but one thing I gain is a lower pitch attitude. So what that is helping me do is it's helping me see the ground. It's helping me find that airport if I've just, say, broken out of instrument conditions. So changing pitch attitude is another result of extending flaps. Another thing that extending flaps can do, anything that's lowering your stall speed is going to decrease the turn radius that's possible in a turn. So, for example, if you double your airspeed, you actually quadruple your turn radius. So, said another way, if you cut your airspeed in half, you cut your turn radius in a no-wind condition in a quarter. So, velocity has an incredible impact on turn radius. So anything that's lowering our stall speed is going to allow us to turn, make a U-turn in confined areas more effectively. And that comes up in, of course, the canyon turn scenario where you, hopefully not, but you've gotten yourself into a situation where you are not able to climb over the terrain, and you're going to have to hang a U-turn in a confined area. And one thing I see, or I hear on practical exams, is I'll often ask people, so why does the FAA ask you to do a chandelle? And one thing I hear is that, well, the chandelle is a perfect maneuver for a canyon turn. And it's actually not at all. This is for an article that I did last year and for Pilot Magazine. And what I did is I ran a simulation on what my turn diameter would be if I did a chandelle versus if I slowed the aircraft down with flaps deployed and did a canyon turn at a very low airspeed. And you can see the difference in those is huge. For example, under this no-wind situation, my diameter turn in the canyon turn using that technique is about 1,100 feet. Whereas for the chandelle, it's on the order of, it's almost 3,500 feet. So there's a huge difference. Please don't think of a chandelle if you're in that kind of a tight situation. You need to get yourself out. You should be thinking of the canyon turn. And flaps can help with that. You'll see in many of the recipes for the canyon turn, flaps play a big role. So putting all of that together, extending flaps definitely gives you more lift. It also gives you more drag. And when you try to compare those two, you'll see that the lift to drag ratio goes down. So if you're in a situation, say in an engine out situation where you're trying to get the glide the farthest distance you can to get to some favorable terrain, that's when you want to leave your flaps up. Or even if they're available to you, put them in a reflex position as they are on the Lancer and the Maul. Extending flaps can increase your climb and descent angle, which can be a good thing if you're trying to fly over, say, an object, a tree at the end of the runway. It also increases your washout. So that helps for stall characteristics or flying characteristics at low speeds. It does decrease your stall speed, and that's helpful to land in with a short rollout or landing in a confined area. But you may want to think about maybe not having as much of a flap deflection if you're landing in gusty winds, because you'd like to have more aircraft control and not touch down, not have a possibility of touching down on the nose wheel. It does change your pitch attitude, and that can be favorable. So, for example, if you're flying an instrument approach and you want to give yourself every opportunity to see the airport environment when you break out. Say in my Bonanza, it's not true for all airplanes, but typically for low-wing airplanes, it's going to give you that more of a pitch down attitude, and maybe you'd be more likely to see the airport environment. The price you pay for that is you have a greater amount of power required to maintain that descent profile. And finally, it does decrease your turn radius because, again, anything that's helping you fly at a lower airspeed is going to help you make a tight turn in a confined area. So, Max, there you have it. Those are some of the things that, some of those things I knew when I took my private, some of those things I wish I knew when I took my private.
Excellent. And now you're torturing people when they come to you for check rides. Speaking of check rides, I want to come back to something you said a moment ago. You talked about why would chandelles be important? And that's a question you might ask, and you kind of gave what you thought was the wrong answer. Why does the FAA want you to demonstrate chandelles?
So, okay, this is my opinion on it. And by the way, when I ask people that question, it's not one of these, you answer it wrong and it's not correct. My opinion is that it shows that you can command the aircraft authoritatively yet smoothly because you are thinking about that passenger experience. But you have an aircraft that is changing power, pitch, bank. It's an outside reference maneuver. And through all of this, you also have to look out for traffic. So to me, you are one busy pilot, and I can fully understand why it's on the commercial pilot practical exam. But that would be my take on it.
So you're really demonstrating mastery of the aircraft through a wide range of performance changes and so on. That's awesome. Well, before we run, tell us what's new. I know you are an incredibly busy lady, but between teaching college classes and giving check rides and teaching at your flight school, what else is new?
So, like I needed another job, but I have taken one on. Sewanee, the University of the South, at which I am a professor of mathematics. And by the way, I'm teaching aerodynamics this semester as a math class. So that's really fun. That's neat that I get to do that. But Sewanee is also the only liberal arts college in the country that I have ever found that owns its own airport. And so I pitched the idea to the university to get a flight school going there, and they loved it. So we are starting that up so that undergraduates can meet all of their aviation needs in addition to their liberal arts studies. And we are picking up a brand new Cessna 172 at the factory this fall. So the university has really gone all out to make the flight experience the best it could possibly be for our undergraduates. So I'm super excited. I'm the aviation director. Not that I needed another job, but it's an exciting one, and I'm thrilled.
Catherine, you always seem to be having fun, and you've just got so many great things going on. You're making a wonderful contribution to aviation. Where do people go out on the web to find out more about you, your flight school?
Sure, yeah. So you can find out about me with my flight school at aceaerobaticschool.com. And if you have any questions about our flight school at the university, then I'm easy to find on sewanee.edu's website.
That's great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for joining us here again today.
Max, it is always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And my thanks again to Catherine Cavagnaro for joining us. You can, of course, find her at aceaerobaticschool.com. And if you'd like to see the bonus video of the interview, which includes the slides that she showed, it's available for people signed up on Patreon at the $20 a month level and higher. To do that, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And you've probably seen Catherine's articles in AOPA Pilot magazine, but you can also find them online, and I've included a link to her AOPA articles in our show notes at aviationnewstalk.com/180. Coming up next, listener feedback and questions right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Here's an email from one of our longtime supporters, Fred Canavan. He says, I know you have an episode that discusses in part the bad habit of using a moving map as a flight instrument. This is a serious problem that I've been observing across the board with many GA pilots. Conversely, I almost never see this when I fly as part of a professional crew. The technique I try to impress upon pilots is to have a chart on an iPad or just print them out at home and have them on paper and use the screen space on something like a GTN 750 to display approach waypoints. Or in the case of a G1000, make sure that the flight plan is displayed in the lower right corner of the PFD. It's easy to see the tendency for a pilot to stare at the moving map and continue banking into a turn until the blue plane behaves the way he wants it to. And that's the problem. They're flying the blue plane on the chart rather than the real airplane, and that becomes more of a detached experience video game. There's also something more insidious going on. Moving map is such a gratifying input that pilots tend to stare at it, neglecting the rest of the panel, and God forbid they look outside. If a pilot just has the flight plan waypoint information up, they get the information they really need in 1 second and then go back to aviating. I know this because a regular habit I have riding along with other pilots is to casually time how long the pilot spends fiddling with or staring at the navigation box without looking away. In VMC, it should not be more than 15 or 20 seconds, and in IMC, even less before a quick scan. I was taught, and I'm sure you were too, to grab a dial, look away, give it a twist, and then look back for a fine adjustment. At least do a quick scan between inputs. And yes, that's the way I was taught to tune radios in IMC. Look, grab the knob, look back at the instrument, make some clicks while looking at the instruments, and then look back at the radio to see if you need any more clicks. Fred continues, of course, it will be argued that autopilots are relied on during these heads-down operations, but in VMC, not looking out the window is inexcusable. And in IMC, I regularly observe that the flight director autopilot changes modes, sometimes as a result of manipulating the navigator box without the pilot noticing until I point it out. Thanks for all you do, Fred. And yes, Fred, I see this all the time. I see people push buttons on the autopilot and don't realize that they've ended up with the wrong mode until I point it out to them. This comes from Michael in Oregon. He says, I thought you might enjoy this story. I was headed out of Astoria, Oregon to Eugene, where my newly completed RV-8 currently resides and awaits further flying hours to complete Phase 1. Braking for a red light, I got rear-ended by a nice lady in a Buick. Rear hatch of my Highlander caved in, airbag spared her. After I got all done with police and firefighters, I proceeded on my trip, but within 5 miles or so, the smell of burning rubber and exhaust in the car accompanied a worsening headache. I pulled over to take a closer look at my car damage, and as I did, the CO detector I had in a box in the back seat, which I was going to install in my cockpit, began alarming. Road trip duly abandoned. And we talked about carbon monoxide in aircraft back in episodes 88, 90, and 102 if you'd like to check those out. And now for some listener questions. This comes from Carlton Roos via Facebook Messenger. He says, I fly a G1000 VFR, and I wonder if there is a way to use GPS approaches to give me glide slope information without flying the entire approach. Max Juan Kenobi, you're my only hope. P.S. Love your book. Well, thanks so much. Guy wrote back to Carlton and said, sure, you could load a GPS approach and use it for glide slope information when flying a VFR. There may be some limitations, though, if you try to join the approach inside the final approach fix, which is typically about 5 miles from the runway threshold. A better choice in some upgraded G1000s and in GTN 650s and 750s and the G3000 is to load the visual approach to a runway. That creates the same kind of glide slope as a GPS instrument approach, and you could join it at any distance from the runway, including a tightly flown traffic pattern. One downside of visual approaches is that there's no guarantee they won't fly you through a hill if you join them far from the runway. So truly, you need to be in VMC conditions when flying them. Hope that helps. And from Patreon supporter Chris Miller in Alaska, thank you, Max, for all of your energy for sharing aviation. I appreciate your shows. As a newbie CFI, I sometimes struggle with how, what, and when to teach GPS navigation. Those tools have so many features, it seems like I can never hit the mark perfectly. We have the Garmin 430-530 for our IFR fleet and 495 type for our VFR fleet. Yes, we need to update in the modern world, but it still works. Do you have any specific recommendations about how and when to introduce the technology and what techniques to give students to learn? And to answer your question, Chris, I probably don't do a lot with GPS until about the 6th lesson when I'm teaching a student pilot how to land. I take pilots to about 10 neighboring airports to learn the area and to also practice landings. And we use GPS for most of those trips, so they become fairly familiar with the basic functions of using the GPS by the time we've been through all of those airports and they're ready to solo. And if you have any feedback or listener questions, you can send them to me by going to aviationnewstalk.com, then click on Contact at the top of the page. And before we go, let me ask for your help in sharing this show with your friends. The easy way to do that is look at whatever app you're listening to us now and click on the share button. Send it to a friend and then follow up with him or her and encourage them to click the subscribe button. Of course, the show is free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.